And this happened primarily because I was studying architecture. I was trained as an architect at the University of Pennsylvania. And I was in school at a point when most of the models that we have, the examples that we were shown, the references that we were given for looking at the city were European. And American cities were seen to be somehow deficient. They weren't dense enough. They didn't have enough history. And so there was a generation of urban designers and architects that were trained to feel a sense of inferiority about where they came from, and that we were either somehow not properly educated in the West, or we somehow didn't quite have the literacy to produce, quote, real cities. So my basic project has been to try to, look at the city from an American point of view, let's say. And in doing so, I found myself reading a range of authors, most of them European authors writing in the 1980s and 90s. And I found this funny thing that a whole host of European authors and architects, people like Kenneth Frampton, the British architectural historian, or this obscure Dutch architect Ramat Koolhaas, or others like Lars Lerup, essentially Europeans writing about the American city, came to this funny conclusion that if you wanted to take the American city seriously, you had to understand something about landscape. And this was kind of puzzling to me because I had never studied landscape. I had not taken a course. I hadn't read a book. I had no idea. My student loans came due. I'd finished graduate school, and I thought, well, this is interesting. I better figure this part out. So I decided that maybe teaching would be a good thing to do. And starting a teaching career, I started reading into landscape and its relationship to cities. And over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, I've basically inherited a role as a kind of talking head, trying to explain these transformations that are happening to various audiences. The discourse around landscape urbanism kind of speaks for itself now. It's in a kind of middle age, let's say, and for better and for worse, kind of has its own half-life. Over the course of the last several years, since the book has been out, I've been invited increasingly to give talks to audiences about urban design and planning. And most often, I've been invited to address audiences of urban designers and planners who are asking a kind of basic question. Haven't we been trying to do this for the last 35 years? Isn't landscape urbanism simply a kind of a repackaging, a rebranding of an idea that's been around for a very, very long time? An idea that's as old as at least Ian McHarg's idea of organizing the planning of the city around ecological knowledge. You'll remember McHarg's 1969 text, Design with Nature, which codified his approach to ecological planning. And for many architects and urbanists and landscape architects, that McHargian agenda of organizing the city through planning was based on the idea that environmental knowledge could help us make more sensible decisions about city form that would allow us to make more kind of sane policy decisions and to build the city in a more healthful way. And my response has been, over the course of the last several years, to turn down most of those invitations to give those talks because I frankly didn't know enough about planning or its history. But in the past year, I've agreed to give a talk to two audiences. One was to the American Planning Association in their conference in Las Vegas, and the other was to the Department of Urban Planning at Harvard, both of whom invited me to try to explain landscape urbanism and how it had anything to do with this larger McHargian project of regional planning. And so the talk I've organized tonight is really an extension of those thoughts, and I'm essentially trying to answer that question. What's the relationship between landscape urbanist practice, the theories and the practices around landscape urbanism, and this longer history, this half-century history of regionally informed ecological planning? Yeah? So my basic thesis is beginning with a question. How is it that we've gone in the course of the last 10 or 15 years from ecological design to designer ecology? And that formulation from ecological design to designer ecology is not mine. It's the work of a planner called Nina Marie Lister, who teaches in Toronto. She's somebody who's given quite a lot of thought to this question herself. And I apologize about the circle. That's kind of it's a cheap shot, but I tried to use it as a way to convey up front this kind of transition that's occurred between the McHargian agenda, which was the idea of a kind of welfare state planning bureaucracy, using rational, scientific decision-making, to the present culture. And I'm using this Rem Koolhaas Bruce Mao entry, the winning entry, in fact, to the Downsview design competition in Toronto of 2001, the kind of soothing Teletubby landscape of circular imagery that was so seductive and convinced the jury that it needed to be built. That transition from ecological design to designer ecology is a kind of shorthand for our topic tonight. And my working thesis is this, is that landscape urbanism represents a fairly distinct paradigm shift, a kind of break with that agenda of ecological planning, and that the McCargian idea about organizing the city around ecological knowledge is, in many contexts, understood to be a kind of dead end. Yeah? Now, I'm overstating that, but the critiques of this McCargian approach have been quite well published and are available. For our purposes this evening, my point is simply that the McCargian idea of regional planning is a dead end, not because of the failure of McCart's project. He was an amazingly successful educator and advocate, not because it wasn't emulated around the world. In fact, he became an agent for transforming the way that landscape architects and planners were trained. That McCargian agenda became a dead end primarily because we decided not to plan our cities. That is, cities in North America tend to be the result of economic processes, much more so than they tend to be the result of planning processes. So it wasn't that we didn't have the ecological knowledge. It wasn't that we didn't have the agreement that, well, we could plan cities to be more healthful. It essentially became a non-starter because we exist in a world which is increasingly organized around what's called neoliberal economic orders, right? The idea that private capital decides the shape of the city in a very complex tussle with land and land ownership. And that's largely eclipsed the idea that we would plan for the shape of cities. So a part of what I want to say this evening has to do with the status of urban planning and design. And what I want to suggest is, by way of illustrating a couple of examples, that planning has become in many venues really an obstacle or an impediment to the organization of the city in ecological or environmental terms. And that ironically, landscape urbanism has emerged in the last 10 or 15 years precisely as a means to move around or to obviate the need for planning mechanisms which are perceived to be ineffectual, maybe even in some contexts corrupt. Now that's a broad claim, and I want to unpack that. I want to support that with a couple of examples, and along the way I'll also be referring to a range of projects that some of which may not have been published as broadly as others have been. And I'm also trying to sketch a geography which is maybe increasingly international to show you the kinds of impact that the landscape urbanist discourse is having internationally. So of course the discussion of urban planning has something to do also with the status of urban design as a discipline. You'll recall urban design was invented about 50 years ago in a couple of universities in the English language